My husband's name was Robert Lane. He died on a Tuesday in March. By the following Friday, his daughter from his first marriage had already retained an attorney and filed a formal legal challenge to his will. I was still writing thank you notes for the flowers people had sent to the funeral home. That is where this story begins, not with his death, with what happened 5 days after it. I want you to understand something before I continue. I am not here to be dramatic. I am not here to make anyone into a monster. I am 71 years old, and I am sitting in this room because what happened to me is happening to other people right now, today, and most of them will never speak about it. Most of them are too ashamed, or too exhausted, or too certain that no one will believe them. I was all of those things for a long time. I am not anymore. Robert and I met in 2001. We were both in our 50s, both had been married before, both had adult children from those first marriages. He had two, a son named Daniel and a daughter named Christine. I had one daughter, Margaret, who was 28 at the time. A mutual friend introduced us at a church supper in our town outside Columbus, and we sat next to each other for 3 hours and talked about nothing particularly important. And then we talked on the phone every evening for 2 weeks about everything else. We got married in the spring of 2003. Small ceremony, about 20 people. Robert wore a blue tie that Margaret had helped him choose because he said he was hopeless with colors and he wanted to get it right. Christine did not attend. Daniel came, stayed through the ceremony, shook my hand at the small reception we held afterward, and left before the cake was served. I noticed both of those things. I said nothing. I want to be clear about that. I noticed. From the very beginning, I knew that Robert's relationship with his children was complicated in ways that had nothing to do with me. He had been divorced from their mother for nearly 15 years by the time we met. The divorce had not been simple. There had been years of silence between him and both children, followed by years of careful, formal contact. They saw him at Christmas, sometimes at Thanksgiving. They did not call him. He called them. He called, and sometimes they returned the call, and sometimes they did not. He spoke about this rarely and without self-pity, which was one of the things I respected most about him. He said once, when we were sitting on the back porch late on a summer evening, that he understood why Christine and Daniel felt the way they did. He said the marriage had been unhappy for a long time before it ended, and that the children had witnessed more of that than they ever should have. He said he had not been the father he could have been when they were small, and that he had never stopped thinking about it. He said he hoped someday they might let him try to be better. I loved him more for saying that than I know how to put into words. We made a life in the house I had owned since 1989. A 4-bedroom colonial I had bought with my first husband and stayed in after that divorce. Robert sold the condo he had been renting, and we used a portion of that money to renovate the kitchen and add a screened porch along the back of the house. He planted a vegetable garden the first summer we were together and tended it every season after that until his knees made it too difficult. Our neighbor across the street, Mrs. Hensley, used to say that Robert's tomatoes were the only reason she had not moved to be closer to her daughter in Arizona. He loved hearing that. He would bring her a paper bag of them every August and stay on her porch for an hour talking. We had 22 years. I need you to hold that number. 22 years is not a late life arrangement. It is not a comfort for two people who did not want to be alone. It is a life. It is breakfast every morning, and the same side of the bed, and knowing how the other person takes their coffee without asking. It is 2 cars, 3 dogs over the years, 4 grandchildren between us, 2 knee surgeries, and 1 bout of breast cancer that I went through because Robert sat in a hospital chair beside my bed and read me the newspaper out loud every morning for 6 weeks straight, including the sports section, which neither of us cared about at all. It is a house that smells like a life lived inside it. Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in September of 2021. He was 74. The doctors spoke honestly with him about what they expected, and he received that information the way he received most difficult things, which was quietly and then with deliberate care. He made a list. He called Daniel. He called Christine. I was in the kitchen both times, close enough to hear the low steadiness of his voice, going through the facts in the same order, same tone, one child and then the other. He told them the diagnosis. He told them what the doctors had said about the timeline. He told them he wanted to see them. He told them he loved them. Daniel came in October. He drove up from Cincinnati and stayed for a long weekend. He and Robert watched college football and had conversations in the indirect way that men of their generation approach things they cannot say plainly. I made dinner both evenings and gave them as much space as I could without disappearing entirely. When Daniel left on Sunday, he held his father for a long moment in the front hallway, and I saw Robert's face over his son's shoulder, and the expression on it is not something I will ever forget or ever fully describe. Christine did not visit. She called twice in the first month, and then the calls became less regular, and then they stopped. Robert did not tell me what they discussed in those early conversations. I did not ask him. There are things between a parent and a child that belong to them alone, and I understood that. I did not push. In November, Robert asked me to come with him to see his estate attorney. His name was Mr. Alderman, and he had handled Robert's legal affairs for over a decade. We sat together in his office on a gray Thursday afternoon, and Robert explained his wishes with the clarity of a man who had thought carefully about every word. He wanted to leave the house and the primary portion of his estate to me. He wanted to leave a meaningful but smaller amount to each of his children. He was precise about the numbers. He explained to Mr. Alderman, and to me, that his reasoning was straightforward. I would need the financial stability that the house and the estate provided. The house had been mine for over a decade before he and I married. He did not think it was right to place its future in the hands of anyone other than me. He also said, and I remember this exactly, that he hoped his children would understand. He said he had written each of them a letter explaining his thinking, and that he planned to send those letters before the will was signed. He said he was not excluding them. He was caring for his wife while also honoring his children, and he believed there was a difference between those two things that reasonable adults could recognize. Mr. Alderman prepared the will. Robert signed it in December. He was still himself in December. He was thinner than he had been in the fall, and he tired more easily, but he was clear and deliberate and fully present in that room. Mr. Alderman was careful in a way that I only later understood the full value of. There were notes. There was a process. Robert's capacity was not in question by anyone in that office on that day. I was not present for the signing itself. Robert had asked me not to be, not because he was concealing anything, but because he wanted it to be his act, his decision, carried out by him alone with proper witnesses. He showed me the document that evening. We sat at the kitchen table and he walked me through it, page by page. I asked whether he had spoken with Daniel and Christine. He said the letters had been sent. He said Christine had not replied. He said Daniel had called and the conversation had been difficult, but that he believed Daniel had heard him, even if he did not fully agree. Robert died on the 9th of March, 2022. He was at home, in the bedroom we had shared for 19 years, which is what he had asked for. Margaret was there, I was there. The hospice nurse had arrived the previous evening and stayed through the night. It was just after 4 in the morning on a Tuesday. Outside the windows, the street was dark and very quiet. I will not describe those hours in more detail than that. Some things are not mine to give away. The funeral was the following Saturday. The church was full in a way that reminded me how long Robert had been part of this community, first as my husband's acquaintance when I lived here with my first husband, then as my neighbor, and finally as himself, known in his own right. People came from his former office, from the church, from the neighborhood, from what had somehow grown over the years into a small, informal community of people who had received bags of tomatoes from his garden. Daniel was there. He sat in the front pew with his wife and their two youngest children. He read a short passage from Scripture at the service. He was composed and generous, and he found me in the receiving line and held my hands and told me that his father had loved me very much. I believed him. I still believe him. Christine was there as well. She arrived just before the service began and took a seat in the third row. She did not speak at the service. She came through the receiving line, took my hand briefly, and said she was sorry for my loss. Not our loss, my loss. I noticed the word she chose. I set it aside. I was surrounded by people who had loved Robert, and I was not going to allow a single pronoun to take me apart on that day. Not that day. The week after the funeral moved in the slow, particular way that weeks after funerals move. Cards arrived. Casseroles appeared on the front porch. The phone rang steadily with the voices of people who did not know what to say, but called anyway because calling was something. Margaret stayed with me for the first week. My friend Carol came every morning to sit with me over coffee. I was tired and empty, and grateful in equal measure. On the Friday after the funeral, 5 days after Robert was in the ground, I received a phone call from Mr. Alderman. He told me he had received formal notice that Christine Lane had retained an attorney and was contesting Robert's will. The legal grounds, he explained to me in the careful voice of a man delivering news he had delivered many times before, were undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. In plain language, her attorney was arguing two things: that I had used my role as Robert's wife and caregiver to manipulate him into writing his will in my favor, and that Robert, when he signed that document in December, had not been mentally capable of understanding what he was signing. I asked Mr. Alderman to repeat what he had said. He did. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where Robert had shown me the will 3 months before. I held the phone and I did not speak for what felt like a very long time. Mr. Alderman waited. He has been practicing law for 30 years, and I think he understood that there was nothing useful he could say in that moment. When I finally asked what this meant practically, he told me. It meant that the distribution of Robert's estate would be paused entirely while the challenge was pending. It meant the joint accounts we had held together would be frozen during the dispute. It meant I would need to retain my own legal representation immediately. It meant the process could take months. It could, he said carefully, take longer. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think if you are listening to this, there is a chance that what I am describing sounds familiar. Not necessarily your own life, but someone you know. A parent, a friend, a neighbor who mentioned something once and then went quiet. If any of this sounds like a situation someone near you is already in, or heading toward, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment. I read every one. The most important thing I have learned through all of this is that the people going through it almost never talk about it, and the silence makes everything worse. It makes it easier for it to keep happening. Ms. Torres was the attorney Mr. Alderman referred me to, a woman who specialized in contested estates and who became, over the following 18 months, one of the most significant people in my life. She was methodical. She did not soften things unnecessarily. On our first meeting, she laid out what the process would involve, and she did not pretend it would be simple. The challenge had two components. The undue influence claim argued that I had used my proximity to Robert during his illness to pressure or manipulate him. The lack of testamentary capacity claim argued that Robert, in December, had not been mentally competent to execute a valid will. Ms. Torres told me the capacity claim would be the harder one for Christine's side to sustain, because Mr. Alderman had been thorough, and because the will had been signed months before Robert's condition deteriorated significantly. The undue influence claim was more subjective, she said, and therefore more difficult to defend against cleanly. What followed was a process I was entirely unprepared for, and I say that as someone who believed herself to be a reasonably capable adult who understood how the world worked. I had to provide documentation of my marriage, our marriage certificate, photographs, witnesses who could attest to the nature of our relationship over 22 years. I had to provide financial records going back to the year we married, bank statements, tax returns, property records, the paperwork from the kitchen renovation, every joint account we had ever held. I had to sit for a deposition, at which Christine's attorney questioned me for over 4 hours about the timeline of Robert's illness, about conversations I had or had not had with his children, about whether I had been present during his medical appointments, about whether I had in any way discouraged him from maintaining contact with Christine or Daniel. I answered every question. I had nothing to hide, and I answered everything. What I learned several months into the process, from a document Ms. Torres received during discovery, was that Christine's attorney had also approached 2 of Robert's former colleagues and one of our neighbors to collect statements. One of the former colleagues had provided a written statement saying that Robert had told him, years before his illness, that his children had always been wary of me. I did not know that Robert had said that to anyone. I do not know the conversation in which he said it, or the context around it. It was entered into the record, and I could not undo it. That was the day I stopped expecting the process to be fair in any intuitive sense. Legal and fair are not the same thing. I understand that now in a way I did not before. About 8 months into the challenge, Ms. Torres called me with a settlement offer from Christine's side. They would withdraw the challenge in exchange for a substantially larger share of the estate. The amount they were proposing would have required selling the house to cover it. I took 3 days to sit with that. Margaret came and stayed those 3 days. We talked about it until there was nothing left to say. My daughter, who had watched 18 months of this process without saying a single negative word about Christine out of respect for Robert's memory, sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked me very quietly what Robert would have wanted me to do. I declined the settlement. The case continued for another 10 months after that. The judge ultimately rejected Christine's challenge in its entirety. The will was upheld. The court found no credible evidence of undue influence and noted that the documentation surrounding the execution of the will was thorough and consistent with a person of sound mind acting of his own volition. Robert's wishes were honored. I kept the house. I tell you this, and I recognize it sounds like the right ending. It sounds like the system worked. And in a narrow technical sense, it did. The will was upheld. Justice, in the legal definition of the word, was done. What the ruling did not restore was the portion of Robert's estate that had been consumed by 28 months of legal fees. What it did not undo was the experience of having my marriage examined by strangers in a conference room, of having my character assessed by neighbors who were asked to comment on whether I had seemed controlling. What it did not give back was the 1.5 years during which I could not access funds I needed, during which I lived with the constant awareness that the home I had owned for over 30 years might need to be sold to satisfy a legal outcome. Daniel called me the day after the ruling. He was the only one who did. He did not explain his sister or defend her. He said he was sorry for everything that had happened and that he hoped I could find some peace. I thanked him. I meant it. I have not spoken with Christine since the day her attorney filed the initial documents. I am 71 years old. I still live in this house. The screened porch Robert built is still there. The vegetable garden is smaller than it used to be, but it is still there. Last summer I grew tomatoes, and I brought a bag of them to Mrs. Hensley across the street, because that was something Robert did every August for 14 years, and because some things should not be allowed to simply disappear. What I want you to take from what I have told you is not the outcome. The outcome is mine. What I want you to take is what came before it, because what came before it was preventable. If you are in a second marriage, if your spouse has children who are not your children, if there is any complexity in your family structure involving an estate or a property or assets that will eventually need to pass somewhere, please talk to an estate attorney now. Not when someone receives a diagnosis, not after. Now. Make sure the documents exist and that they are properly executed and that there is a clear record of the process, not just the result. Make sure your spouse talks to his or her children before they find out what the will says from an attorney's letter. That conversation is uncomfortable. It is far less destructive than the alternative. What Christine did was legal. She had the right to challenge that will. I am not saying otherwise. What I am saying is that a different set of choices made years earlier might have meant that right was never exercised. That the letters Robert sent arrived in a context of relationship rather than silence. That the grief of losing a father did not immediately convert into a legal strategy. I do not know whether that was possible. I only know it did not happen. Robert believed his children would understand. He wrote them letters. He sent those letters before he died. I do not know what was in them. I know Christine read hers, and 5 days after her father's funeral, she had an attorney. I have spent 2 years thinking about what that means, about what she must have been feeling, about whether any of it was truly about money, or whether money was simply the shape that grief took when it had nowhere else to go. I do not have an answer. I may never have one. What I have is this house, and my daughter, and the neighbors who showed up with casseroles, and the memory of a man who grew tomatoes and read me the sports section in a hospital room, even though neither of us cared about the scores. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. But it should not have cost what it cost to hold on to it. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If something I said today matters to someone in your life, please share it with them. Not as a warning that turns into fear, but as information that might lead to a conversation that should have happened already. A conversation with an attorney. A conversation between a parent and a child about what comes after. A conversation that is hard to start and much harder to skip. You do not have to go through what I went through to learn what I learned. That is the only reason I am here. Take care of yourself. And if you know someone walking into the situation I described, tell them they are not alone. It matters more than you know.